Welcome to Economic Development Unravelled, a channel dedicated to investigate, solve, and explain economic development. Why is India still a developing country even after 75 years had passed since the nation gained independence? Countries such as Taiwan, South Korea, and China were on par with India during the 1950s. In fact, South Korea was poorer than India during the early 1960s. Within the next 50 years, South Korea had transformed into a world leader in many high-technology industries. The Korean giants have become globally dominant companies and drive the industry they operate in. Samsung, Hyundai, POSCO are heavyweights in technology, automotive, and steel making. On the other hand, India remains as ever a developing nation with vast aspirations to become a modern developed country and a global economic power. But the nation is far behind the goals and aspirations of its people. Interestingly, India's rival, China, is already an upper-middle-income nation. Both nations were more or less in a similar condition during the 1950s and 60s. But China paced ahead since the 1980s. Today, China is currently the second largest economy behind the United States and will very soon overtake the US to become the largest economy in the world. Why has India failed to develop? Ask any top economist, or look up any economic development book, blog, or journal, some version of the question why India has failed to develop. The answers always are versions of one or more of these. India suffers with corruption, high taxes, and regulation. India lacks infrastructure, manufacturing, and high-quality education. India has legacy problems like democracy, institutions, and overpopulation. India is not business-friendly, lacks innovation and entrepreneurial spirit. Only few can recognize that these features of India are not the main problem, but a byproduct of the nation's failure to develop. Overpopulation in India is not why the nation had remained underdeveloped but due to its failure to develop. India's lack of infrastructure and manufacturing is not hurting development. But its failure to figure out how to develop is why the nation is lacking both infrastructure and manufacturing. So, what's the solution here? Towards the far side of Asia, on the shores of the Pacific Ocean, nations like Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and China had managed a miracle, the so-called East Asian miracle. They grew their economies rapidly and transformed into high-income and upper-middle-income nations. A few economists had long believed that discovering how these nations had managed to grow rapidly can guide the underdeveloped nations replicate the same. But decades passed and millions of dollars spent on research and economists had failed to crack the miracle. The problem of economic development is much deeper. It is rooted in nature. To understand, let's see what economic development looks like. Economic development means adding more new wealth to the existing wealth stock of a nation. New wealth comes from making new capital investment. Creating new capital means the nation has to build new businesses, factories, housing, vehicles, ports, highways, railways, and airports. Rapid economic development means making those new capital investments every year but at a much faster rate for at least 30 years straight. How much faster? Well, let's explore the case of China for example. Looking at 35 years of China's rapid growth starting from 1981 to 2015 all the way. We see that China has made gigantic annual investments, from tens of billion US dollars in 1980s to trillions of US dollars in 2010s. But what China had managed to do is not easy. In order to make large new capital investments, a nation requires large volume of new savings. Well, let's look at China's savings during that same period. China had managed to create a high portion of its national income into savings, going from below 20% in the early 1980s to all the way above 40% in 2015. Now, let's take a look at India's savings in comparison with China. It is obvious that India's savings rate pales in front of China's. India had to wait an entire half a century since the country became a republic to touch 15% savings rate. Further, India's savings never went beyond 25% in its history. But how did China manage to save so much to make all those new capital investments? Economists never had an answer. You see, the rich industrialized nations such as the USA, the UK, Germany, and France have always had very low savings throughout their rise during the 19th and 20th century. The only major exceptions were Taiwan, South Korea, and China. The question is how Taiwan, South Korea, and China had managed to build so much savings while India had not. India is not an exception. Underdeveloped and developing nations often struggle to build high savings. Discovering answer to that question will allow us to solve so many problems. Economists have tried and failed for more than 50 years to understand how nations create savings. They always came up empty-handed. The questions remain. Can we ever crack economic development? How can an underdeveloped nation improve its national savings and investment? How can a nation go from low income, technology poor to high income, technologically sophisticated, and that too, rapidly? When we go back and check the average savings rate of the wealthy industrialized nations, the USA, the UK, Germany, and France, we see that their average rates over such a long period do not go beyond 10% or barely above. Whereas the average rates of Taiwan, South Korea, and China during their rapid growth period went beyond 20%. China even boasts a breathtaking 30% average savings rate between 1981 and 2015. How can underdeveloped nations build savings like China? Here's the secret that nobody knows. It all goes back to certain basic principles that economists had dearly missed. It starts with something very simple. Consider, for instance, a personal scenario. During any given period, when you spend 70% of your income, the remaining 30% of your income is obviously your net savings, right? Surprisingly, a nation's savings doesn't work like that. How and why is beyond simple. There has been an extraordinary development in economics recently. It has been discovered that nature has capped the annual savings rate of a nation to just 10% of its national income. Which means, a nation, for example, has $100 billion in national income, it can have savings no more than $10 billion, just 10% of its annual income. If that's the case, then how come Taiwan, South Korea, and China have managed annual savings rates well beyond 10% and up to 45% for decades? The recent research has also made a stunning discovery that a nation can go beyond the 10% savings limit through international trade. How is that possible? Let's understand how it all works. A nation has to export a lot of goods to foreign nations and use that exchange dollars to import capital goods. Since the total new savings of nation is nothing but its total new investment, its savings go up when it imports capital goods. The Northeast Asian nations, Taiwan, South Korea, and China have implemented economic policies that incentivized exports above anything else. They placed very high import duties on consumer goods, which effectively meant whatever the foreign exchange the nation's exporters earned was made available for importing only capital goods. Here's how it works out. The exporters earn US dollars from foreign nations in return for shipping goods to those nations. The exporters then take the dollars to the bank and exchange for national currency. The importers in the country, on the other hand, exchange national currency with the bank for US dollars so they can pay foreign nations in US dollars and import capital goods, such as machinery and equipment. All three nations, Taiwan, South Korea, and China, have had massive exports. They exported a large percent of their GDP to foreign nations, and used the export dollars to import capital goods. All this means, we should see a correlation between exports rate and savings rate of these nations. Why? Because the more an underdeveloped nation exports, the more it will have the capacity to import capital goods to increase investment, and in turn, its savings. Let's see if this is true for Taiwan. Taiwan's savings rate surged as the island nation's exports rate increased. And the same goes for South Korea. Its savings rate surged as and when its exports rate increased. And same for China. The nation's gigantic savings buildup is a result of its export might. It all started in the 1950s when Japan started targeting exports to earn foreign exchange. That was the only way the nation could pay for the imports that it desperately lacked at home, like oil, metal ore, and machines. Neighbors Taiwan and South Korea saw Japan's success and followed its economic policies. Likewise, China also later on. What happened was that these nations approached their trade and investment problems with simple and straightforward solutions. They had engaged in international trade in a manner that allowed them to rack up higher savings rate, astonishingly without the knowledge of how they had done that. Over the course, Japan had managed to rebuild the wealth that got destroyed during the Second World War. Whereas Japan emerged bigger and stronger, Taiwan and South Korea started from scratch, transforming the Northeast Asian region into global economic corridor. During all this time, economists had struggled to understand how these miracle nations had managed to build up very high savings rates while other underdeveloped nations continued to struggle. The thing is, neither these three nations nor the economists know, until now and until the making of this video, that the reason they had high savings rate is due to their economic policy of targeting increasingly high exports and using those foreign earnings to importing mostly capital goods to support domestic investment needs. But today, we know what nations have to do to create high savings rates. Now, let's take a look at India. After opening and reform in the 1990s, India started to witness its exports surging. Once exports rose, the capital goods such as machinery and equipment it imported automatically raised the nation's savings rate. But India had failed to hit the high gear in that aspect. That is because the nation never had an export target policy like the Northeast Asian nations. So, its exports rate and savings rate have always lagged China. And that is why India is still a developing nation. That's it for today. If you want to learn more about the content in this video and the new thinking in economics, dive into the upcoming The General Theory of Rapid Economic Development book. You'll find the link in the description below. Hit the thumbs up button if you like this video. Send your thoughts to me in the comments section. Subscribe to this channel if you want to watch more quality content like this.